I don't usually like to talk about politics because it's largely a matter of opinion, and I prefer to deal with matters of fact. As an activist in the atheist community, I've noticed that people are usually happy to hear me talk about science, even though scientists are, well, they have low tolerance for fools, and they're brutal judges, and so you better not get anything wrong. Folks are generally happy to hear me talk about religion too, including religious people, because they like to be offended. Especially by somebody who looks like me. And most of my audience likes to talk about philosophy, even if I myself do not. But whenever I talk about politics, that's when things get ugly, and it doesn't even matter who I'm talking to. I'm sometimes amazed at the differences between what somebody thinks I said versus, or whatever somebody thinks I meant versus whatever I actually said. And how any perceived endorsement of a limited provision will be exaggerated in hyperbole to the most ludicrous extreme possible. If, for example, I think the government has a role to do anything at all, whether by imposing environmental regulations on hazardous or destructive industries, or by preserving equal rights in employment or housing, then the anarchists accuse me of being a statiest, of believing in statism, as if that's the bad thing. As if anything the government does is automatically wrong, or as if anarchy ever got anything right. If I say the government should do X, my critics will imagine that I said that the government should do everything A to Z. This happens every time I reveal any aspect of my own personal political opinions. So while I have criticized the more outrageous proposals and policies of other people's politics, I really haven't much discussed my own. However, as I now find myself in a unique position of addressing any political party, I feel compelled to share my hopes for how that evolving platform will best represent me and trying to support it. As a young man, I wasn't much interested in politics. I wasn't immersed in it, I wasn't involved, I wasn't motivated, I was largely unaware of most of it. Through a series of accidents, I happened to be at the 1988 Iowa caucuses when one of our presidential candidates was Pat Robertson, head of the Trinity Broadcasting Network, leader of the Christian Coalition, and host of the 700 Club. Then, as today, he was always quoted by the press saying something simultaneously hateful and insane. It seems those are the only comments he seems capable of making. I didn't care who else was running at the time. I just couldn't imagine a worse president than somebody like Pat Robertson. I'd never even registered to vote before then. That was my first time. And with the registration table, they asked me if I was a Republican or a Democrat, and I honestly didn't know what it meant to be either one. And the girl who was filling out the forms wasn't going to explain it either. She looked at me through narrow eyes and said, "You're a Democrat." And started filling out my form. And I asked how she knew that, and she looked at me again with narrow eyes and said, "Trust me." Looking back, I think she was a Republican. I never identified as a Democrat, although given only two choices, I have no choice about the vote this one. If you ever saw Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, the way the Grim Reaper describes Englishmen is much the way I describe Democrats. You're all so pompous. None of you have got any clothes. For example, in 2008, I voted for a change I could believe in. And 5 years later, I don't think I've seen any change. Last September, the Democratic Party removed from their platform any reference to God, where the Republican platform mentions God 12 times. But they immediately reversed that position at the National Convention against the vote of the natural majority. They needed a 2/3 majority, and that is not what they got. They also voted 3 times. The first 2 times, it sounded like a tie. The third time, the nays were louder than the ayes, but that wasn't part of the script. And they weren't going to change course just because that's the way the people voted. And that's part of the problem. How can you even call that democratic anymore? So I still don't consider myself a Democrat, although I did share in their delight this last election. That was a fun one, wasn't it? My wife and I sat glued to the computer as we watched this map of gray states light up red or blue. And it was hilarious. Every time one lit up red, my wife would ball up her fist, and this little Minnie Mouse voice start cursing Romney supporters. It was adorable. Even though we are not Obama supporters ourselves, and we voted for him, but we vote for the lesser evil. And every time the greater evil got an advantage in the electoral vote, my mouth would go up. Every time the state lit up blue or the tide shifted the other way, we felt relieved. We were afraid to go to bed because we were terrified that we would wake up in a world ruled by a hand puppet of the religious right. We were primarily concerned that Romney would carry out his threat to select right-wing conservative judges like Scalia and Thomas on the Supreme Court, because changing the balance that way would effectively or could effectively end our democratic republic and put in place an American theocracy. Probably going to run out of power here, which would be disastrous with me. I didn't bring up that power cord. It said it had 3 hours, and it said it had another. Yeah. One second. Pardon me for the interruption.
Jim, adapter.
Nice guy.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for that momentary interruption. And I have to have it all in notes because there's a heck of a lot to go over, and I'm sorry about that. With regard to the Supreme Court and the way that those judges rule, every bad decision at that level is irreparable and sets a disastrous precedent. And opportunistic ideologues will seize every opportunity to do even greater harm. And it bothers me that there are so many people in this country who are so short-sighted that they can't see the obvious eventual consequences of their actions. It is as if they can't see beyond their own personal needs of the next fiscal quarter. For example, in the last interview that George W. Bush gave as president, it was on 9/9, and he was asked if the Bible was literally true, and he laughed and said, probably not. And one of the reasons he gave for that was because there was proof of evolution. So everything that he had said previously about teaching intelligent design was all just to pander the vote of the religious right. Back at the turn of the century, when our beloved W ran against Al Gore, inventor of the internet, I read both the Democratic and the Republican Party platforms, and at that time, in 2000, they weren't very different. They were both religious. One was a bit more overtly religious than the other. Over the next two terms, that rift has widened. They're still both religious, but one is supposedly democratic and the other is theocratic. In a video titled Republican Theocracy, I reviewed the new Republican Party platform that was specifically tailored for Texas. That one is worse than the national one, in that it is less discreet, because Southern conservatives are so comfortable in their secure dominance of my state. They're so immersed in the safety of reassuring numbers that they feel above reproach and will more openly speak their minds, as if they won't be held accountable for any of the damage that they do. I won't give that speech again today. If you're watching this on video, I'll include a link to my earlier video and also where I talk about that on the blog and provide the list of notable citations. Today, I will move on to highlight the most extreme offshoot of the Republican Party, the Tea Party. They claim to be for lower taxes and a better economy, but they seem to be all about religious extremism. The Tea Party platform is made up mostly of misleading quotes from historic Americans who would not have aligned themselves with what the Tea Party now represents. They quoted Abraham Lincoln 10 times, though they did not quote anything he said about God, the Bible, or Christianity. They quoted several other people who either never said anything positive for Christianity or who actually said very negative things against it, men like Thomas Paine, who never shared anything in common with Glenn Beck. I read an article on how Glenn Beck warped extreme liberal Thomas Paine into a teabagger, which was an interesting read, but Paine's position was opposite Beck's on nearly every issue, and if he were alive today, Thomas Paine was more likely to be one of us. And while I'm at it, I should cite another article listing an avalanche of anti-American Tea Party legislation since 2010. It cites the Tea Party's war on anything progressive, inclusive, tolerant, or otherwise liberal, and lists all the specific legislation toward those ends. I'll only highlight the main categories here. According to the article, they have a war on women's reproduction rights that is so extensive in so many states across the nation that I hesitate to list specifics here. There are too many, but a lot of them are outrageous and should be read, so I'll be sure to provide a link when I upload this on video. Part of that offensive includes their war on special supplemental nutritional program for women, infants, and children, also known as WIC. On this matter, I want to point out that I have, for the last dozen years or so, supported my family working for a corporate multinational. I have had several jobs in the last couple of decades, so I've been continuously employed all that time. But there was a time when I was an unemployed single father, and I was the only man sitting in a particular welfare office for women and infant children. I didn't need that moment very long out of my life, and I never needed it again, but I would not want to deny that to anybody that was in a similar situation. As the name suggests, the Tea Party are in an ideological war with the federal government too. In some instances, they want law enforcement to have presiding priority over federal agents. In other cases, they want their own currency, or they want to secede from the Union altogether, either literally or effectively. They don't want any central government telling them what they can or can't do, and they aren't morally accountable enough to do the right thing on their own either. So, of course, they have a war on gun control. And raving lunatics like Alex Jones make it hard for any sane person to defend the Second Amendment the way we used to. They also have a war on Islam, specifically against the encroachment of Sharia law. I would not have a problem with this myself, except that they're trying to teach the Christian counterpart, which is Mosaic law. Sometimes they call it Levitican law. And the more you integrate church and state, the more you pave the way for somebody else's religion to come and take over. History has repeatedly and consistently shown that you can't fight religion with religion. You can only fight religion with reason, and if you're going to do that on a cultural level, you'll need nationally standardized secular education provided in the safety of a securely secular government. The Tea Party. The Tea Party has a war on national public radio as a voice for liberalism. They want to censor that, and not just that. They also have a war on net neutrality. The article says that a free press has always been fascism's greatest enemy, and that's why Republicans want to strangle it. They want to oppose the safeguards of the Federal Communications Commission to allow corporate control of all internet content. This is one of many examples of why federal regulations are necessary and why corporations should not be unleashed without restraint. They have a war on desegregation. That's right. They want schools and businesses racially segregated again. Why do people still think this way? When my wife and I toured the Oral Roberts University, she was reading this thing with him where you could get suspended from that school for interracial dating. You could get expelled for interracial marriage. These are the people behind the Republican Party. These are the people behind the Tea Party. It is the most backward thinking I can come up with. This is another reason why they have a war on Obama. Because they don't want colored kids in their schools. They certainly don't want him as president, right? That's another reason why they have a war on the right to vote. There are 22 states that are preparing or have already passed legislation intended to disenfranchise voters in any circumstances where statistics favor Democratic candidates. The war on marriage equality and the anti-gay agenda. Big surprise, they're not just bigoted against other races, religions, nationalities, political alignments, they're homophobes too. And they don't want to just ban marriage either. They want to prohibit domestic partnerships for civil unions for same-sex couples, and they've lobbied for the right to discriminate against homosexuals with regard to housing and employment. Laughably, I saw a man who was leading a Colorado group of Christians several years ago in my government class before he became otherwise famous. He made an announcement where he wanted to change the constitution of the state to allow discrimination against homosexuality. He said that as Christians, they have a right to treat certain people differently. That man was Ted Haggard. In my own state, things have gotten a little worse. We've had people lobby that violence against homosexuals should not be considered a hate crime for the very reasons that define it as a hate crime. They say that as Christians, they have a right to treat homosexuals as an abomination. And in Tennessee, they're trying to make it illegal for teachers to even utter the word homosexual in a classroom. The war on unions and collective bargaining is the war on the middle class, and it's no secret the GOP wants to eliminate the middle class. One of the ways they want to do this requires that they deregulate Wall Street and quickly divide everyone into the haves and the have-nots. This is another reason why federal regulations are necessary. The war on immigration. In my state, they have suggested that the border be patrolled by armed vigilantes and that we should jail anyone who hires undocumented workers unless they're only hiring the help at their homes, which would effectively legalize slavery. They have a war on technological advances like high-speed rail because they want us to remain addicted to fossil fuels. And this relates to their war on science, the environment, and health, especially where those relate to their separate war on education and their historical revisionism. Hopefully you've all seen the documentary The Revisionaries, or are otherwise already aware of how the religious right fears education. I can talk about this indefinitely, as you probably already know. They don't want the secular government to provide a fact-based education. They want to lie to their own children. They want their kids to see and to believe the same twisted bigotry their parents bought into. They don't want anyone else's kids to know the truth about American history or evolution or sex education, and they don't want their kids to compete with kids of a lower class. And that's why they want all the children who can't afford to go to charter school kicked out on the street, so they will either go to jail or go to work. Because they also have a war on child labor laws, calling them unconstitutional. So they're in their ideal world, the rich kids would grow up misinformed minions, and their estates can be maintained by slaves, and their factories can be operated by underage children with no place to go and no future worth living for. Can the Tea Party be any worse? They want to take us back to the good old days of work camps and the Industrial Revolution. The Tea Party is the very reason this convention is taking place. They, more than anyone else, created a need for a progressive, secular political party. Now, everyone regards American politics as a two-party system, which it effectively is, but technically isn't. There are other parties active in this country. They're just usually, like us, so small that they can't field serious candidates work. They may not be that big as they used to be anymore. For example, there's still a prohibition party. These are the people from the 1930s that were responsible for prohibition of alcohol. They're still out there, hundreds of them. So there's the Prohibition Party, which sounds like an oxymoron. And there's the Marijuana Party, which goes without saying. I mean, putting those two words together sounds a bit redundant to me. The Marijuana Party is an actual political party. If you've never heard of them, it's because they don't actually do anything. I suspect that they lack ambition. They just sit around and talk about who's sexy, Betty or Wilma. You also have the Green Party, which I don't think I have any particular issue with. I couldn't understand why the environment wasn't a pivotal issue in the presidential race in 1992. But the Green Party aren't just environmentalists. They describe themselves as being what the Democratic Party was before the Dems started their recent shift to the right. They're socially conscious and progressive, and they find to allow a political party, they must be progressive. We've got to embrace the future. At least admit that there's going to be one. And that requires responsible preparation. It amazes me that there are people out there, and I've known many growing up, who deny that there is even a future to worry about. They're not progressive. They're against progress. They're actually regressive, wanting to reject all the advantageous advances of the modern age and retreat into some mythical good old days of hard work, discomfort, and early demise due to incurable diseases. It's just like at the Reason Rally, where you saw people protesting against reason. And then in Europe, we've seen the people, the Islamists holding up signs protesting freedom. How can anyone actually protest freedom, reason, and progress? Only the religious. The Constitution Party, typically considered the third party, but they're not progressive, they're not reasonable, and they're not free. They are bound to a belief system opposing required beliefs and prohibited beliefs, both of which are apparently wrong. They are yet another collection of right-wing religious ideologues who I find is indistinguishable from Republicans, which of course is the way they vote. The preamble of the Constitution Party platform gratefully acknowledges the blessing of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as Creator, Preserver, and Ruler of the universe and these United States. So of course what they say about education comes as no surprise, some of that now. All teaching is related to basic assumptions about God and man. Remember that when you study algebra. Education as a whole, therefore, cannot be separated from religious faith. The law of our Creator assigns the authority and responsibility of educating children to their parents. Compulsory attendance laws should be repealed. Parents need not defy the law by refusing to send their children to schools of which they disapprove. We call for the elimination of the Federal Department of Education. We oppose any federal control over the education of children. Under no circumstances should the federal government be involved in national teacher selection for certification, educational curricula, textbook selection, learning standards, comprehensive sex education, psychological and psychiatric research testing programs, and personnel. Note that the fundamentalist religious organizations are openly opposed to psychiatric analysis across the board. Why is that? Perhaps it is because psychiatric drugs can both conjure and cure some forms of spiritual revelation. Regarding their objection to secular education, I could not disagree more. Just last week I spoke to a teacher at a charter school who told me that she had quit her job and she had recognized, even in the blue states of New England, a systematic effort to defund and disable public education in favor of a backward-thinking religious progression. She said that charter schools are not the answer, and that Americans need to build up and improve our state-funded public education system. And I believe this is one of the few things that the government should provide, and it should be standardized nationwide. The purpose of educating children is not so they can be misled, indoctrinated, demoralized, or deceived. It's not so that parents can die secure in their own reaffirmed delusions. It's so that children will understand reality so that they'll be able to do something about it. Only accurate information has practical application, and our next generation needs that. That's one of the things I envy about some Asian schools, where academics actually matter to the students. Their culture encourages that. That's why they have more honor students than we have students. One of the problems we face with a population that is already pushed beyond the limits of natural support and is still growing exponentially is that we need to be a lot more efficient than we have been. Remember that when I was born, the global population had just gotten to 3 billion, and that was an all-time high. It rose to 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, and now 7 just in my lifetime. We have to rely on genetically modified foods and other advances in agriculture just to feed the people we already have. Because even though we can send more fishing boats into Alaskan waters, they collectively take in fewer fish. And what does that tell you? In little more than a single century, we have already consumed and exhausted most of the world's supply of fossil fuels without regard to the future. We can run cars on electricity, and we should, because airlines don't have that option, and there is no technology that can compete with the efficiency of jet travel. So we are wasting resources foolishly, and it seems that no one is thinking ahead, they're thinking behind. Our leaders are marching us backward in the name of religion, and that is why we need a secular party. I know that not all atheists are Democrats. We have at least a couple of Republicans, strange as that may seem. We're not all liberals either, and we're not all fans of Ayn Rand. None of us can speak for all of us. Politically, we're all over the place. But you almost have to be one of us to realize that. Most people in this country seem to think that atheists are all socialists or communists. And they don't know the difference between those either. I was raised to execrate both of those words. I noticed that whenever you have to say either word, you have to say it as if saying it left a bad taste in your mouth. And you can insult someone simply by calling them a communist or a socialist. And if you didn't say it with that kind of sneer, you were suspect. And I outraged family members and babysitters simply by asking what socialism is. I had an idea what communism is. You know, an economic system is juxtaposed to capitalism. But the context always implied that socialism is somehow different. And in order for me to form an opinion, I have to know the facts first. I'm weird that way. I once thought that was true of everyone. Unfortunately, the people that I asked were people who believed what they were told without even trying to understand it. So when I asked the question, what is the difference between communism and socialism? The answer I always got was, they're both just as bad. Well, no, they're not. Canada, the UK, and Scandinavia are all, to a degree, socialist, particularly regarding healthcare, and their people seem pretty happy with that. In fact, my co-host on Magic Sandwich, DPR Jones, is British, and he says that when his country adopted their national healthcare system back in World War II, the people who protested it then in his country were the same people protesting ours in this country: insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, and so on. And if these national healthcare systems didn't work, the people would know it, and they would share that information readily. But to my experience, the Brits seem quite happy with their national healthcare system. In fact, DPR Jones says that any candidate or political party going into an election would be committing political suicide if it suggested cutting the budget of the NHS. Socialism is a measurement of degree, how much of whatever program the central government is directly responsible for. The U.S. is slightly socialist, but only by providing a few plainly beneficial programs for public welfare. If we had a national healthcare system like Europe and Scandinavia do, that would be better. That would also be more socialist. And while this is apparently true, or true up to this point, that does not mean the trend would continue if other programs were compiled onto this one to be entrusted to the central body. Communism is an extreme derivative of socialism. There are actually several socialist parties here in the U.S., but only one communist party, and there are good reasons why. My wife's maternal ancestors are Vietnamese, and my mother-in-law says that for Americans, communist is just a word that paranoid reactionaries love about, without knowing what that means. However, she regards communists as the people who killed a lot of her family and took their estate. So we are talking about very different things here. I believe that the government should provide a few specific benefits to its citizens. Why else would we want to serve our country? I believe there should be some advantage to being an American. But I do not consider myself socialist, and I'm certainly no communist. But neither am I anarchist like libertarians. This is where I start to lose friends. Libertarians are opposed to any national health care system of socialized medicine. They're also opposed to public welfare systems like Social Security and any other old age or low income protections. They think that any degree of shared wealth at that level equals stealing. They're also opposed to any nationally standardized education system. Just like Tea Party Republicans, libertarians want inconsistent variables with no reliable or predictable standard, and they expect these to emerge naturally on their own as guided by a mysterious and invisible will according to their faith in the free market. Whenever I meet an atheist who professes to be a libertarian, I think, well, that's so sad. Have you read your party platform? On rare occasions, they might have, but I don't think they understand it. Most of them don't realize what it says, and I'll go over some of that. At the amazing meeting in Las Vegas, I was invited onto a podcast with the ardent atheists. You guys know the ardent atheists? Somebody out there. Emery, and Heather Henderson. Penn Gillette was in the room with my friend Zonkins Chris. You know Zonkins Chris? Anyway, Penn is a brilliant warrior and very passionate. He's very impressive when he's on the roll, especially when you're in the room with him. And there's so much of what he says I could really get behind. I'd like to think that there's a lot more that we agree on than not, but there are a couple of things, and one of them is the libertarian idea. Penn said something that didn't sit well with science, and she quietly stormed off the set. I had arrived late, didn't realize the rules of the game, and I didn't know that I could sit at the open mic and have a live broadcast argument with Penn Gillette over libertarian politics. How much fun would that have been? I admire Penn and Teller very much, despite what I'm saying now. I mean, their bullshit TV show is one of the great gifts of skepticism, and I mean that sincerely. They're pretty accurate most of the time, but it is ironic that they say that their most popular episode is the one with the segment on bottled water. It's ironic because that episode undermines everything the Libertarian Party is about. Strict libertarianism, let me go into that first. The episode showed that despite promises made by all these advertisers, water bottling companies often failed to meet industry standards enforced by the federal government. Penn and Teller praised government regulatory commissions for ensuring that what the free market has always consistently failed to accomplish in real-world application. Strict libertarianism allows no role of government beyond a very limited degree of law enforcement. They want to absolve government of all but the most minimal abilities and all of its influence. Under the libertarian construct, the government would have no ability or authority to preserve national parks or federal reservations either. Both would become real estate of private parties, and either could be sold out whole or in part. A Chinese power company could buy the Grand Canyon from whoever happened to take it over and set up a hydroelectric dam and flood the whole place. And there is no provision in the Libertarian Party platform that would prevent them to do this, and nothing any collective could legally do about it. The owners of property have the full right to control, use, dispose of, or in any other manner enjoy or destroy their property without interference until or unless the exercise of their control infringes the valid rights of others. Imagine contesting the validity of the rights of others who simply want to enjoy natural wonders that they didn't own and didn't pay for. Under the libertarian system, the government would be prohibited from limiting or denying individuals human rights based on sex, wealth, ethnicity, creed, age, national origin, personal habits, political preference, or sexual orientation. But potential employers, suppliers, or service providers would have no such prohibition because they are not so governed. Being private businesses, they would be permitted to discriminate against whomever they want for whatever reason. The only recourse libertarians offer is that someone so neglected could simply move somewhere else, as if that option existed for just everything, regardless of your roots and connections. As if moving somewhere else meant that they wouldn't experience the same thing in another place. That is not the answer. Libertarians don't want to have their industries restricted by government regulations either. Specifically, the Libertarian Party platform says that we should trust individual property owners and businesses to ensure that our environment remains clean and safe, as with our products also. They expect the free market to exert some mystic control over independent agencies, inspiring them to act responsibly without any motivation or penalty just because it's the right thing to do. Despite the fact that past experience has shown that without imposed regulations, uncontrolled corporations will be just as amoral as any dispassionate despot. Even if the free market really had this imaginability to enforce compliance through emergent properties, libertarians have inserted a giant loophole like a bullet through their own foot, in that they support unrestricted monopolies. The free market could only exist if smaller companies were allowed to compete independently, but allowing unrestricted monopolies would put an end to that, because as some businesses grow larger and acquire more, you'll end up with corporate networks where one company ends up owning or otherwise controlling everything. It's like a game of risk. Eventually, every piece on the board is the same color. And we already know that there are some laws with no boundaries of legal jurisdiction. Without independent companies or competitors, there is no free market. Their system would inevitably lead to a corporate oligarchy wherein nation-states would be governed by omnicorp. In other words, the one world government and inarguable law of every land would soon be a corporatocracy, wherein all the nations on earth could literally fall under the dominion of Walmart and its subordinate branches governing all avenues of every market and every facet of life, until you find yourself on your feet 20 hours a day manufacturing cell phones at rapid pace in exchange for rations sufficient to maintain survival, because no one stopped it when they had a chance, and no one can stop it now. We already know that that is how companies will behave if they are not monitored and restricted. It doesn't matter how criminal Apple was with their industrial employees. iPhones still outsell Androids. The free market does not induce ethics like regulation and litigation do. Sadly, I know a lot of libertarians that are married to that party as if it's some inexorable part of their identity. And I hope they find some resolution for that, because libertarianism is an idea whose time must never come. I have noticed a selfish and irresponsible attitude of just let me do whatever I want. It seems to permeate all of the right-wing factions. They don't want to share anything either, despite everything that Jesus supposedly said. They don't want to be governed, and they don't want to be taxed, and I understand that. I'd like to keep both at a minimum too. But you have to have respectable laws, and you have to contribute something collectively if the country is going to work at all. I think our nation should be a little company. If you pay something into it, you get something out of it, just like your insurance benefits, your 401k, and so on. And our country should provide training for the same reason our country should provide training for the same reason that a company would, to stay competitive and productive. So the first thing I looked up on every platform that I looked into was their stance on education. What is taught and how it's taught is a topic for another time. What I wanted to see was, do they promote a fact-based, state-funded, compulsory national standard with the same expectations applied for every school? That's what it should be, and it should be designed to encourage advancement, because the next generation has to be more informed and better prepared than the last one was. This is necessary not only nationally, but globally. We are going to need innovative idealists capable of ingenious solutions to real-world problems, because they're going to face significant challenges that they're not being prepared for now. I don't think we should raise the minimum wage, because inflation will follow suit. I don't think we should raise taxes either, but we should be much more efficient in our spending, and I mean from the top down. I think government is bloated and could be a lot more lean and a lot more effective at the same time. I think our technology has to be upgraded or refined because what we're doing now doesn't work in the long term. I think unprecedented innovations could be considered regardless of tradition and shouldn't pose any threat to individual happiness otherwise. In fact, that's how our country began. That's why it was founded as a secular nation with a wall of separation. Our founding fathers looked to the future and expected corruption to come and tried to counter it in advance. That is an ongoing struggle. How many times have we already breached the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and so on? And how much more will be allowed? Remember that the first symbol the founding fathers chose for this country was a rattlesnake, declaring "Don't tread on me." Benjamin Franklin, who, despite his many failings in many ways, embodied Enlightenment ideals and said this in defense of the rattlesnake as a country symbol. I recollected that the eye excelled in brightness that of any other animal, that she has no eyelids, that she may be esteemed as an emblem of vigilance. She never begins an attack, nor once engaged, ever surrenders. She is therefore an emblem of magnanimity, and of true courage. This is why I suggested a new name for our party, the American Secular Party, or ASP. And the symbol should be a snake, one preferably associated with an apple. The ASP concerns should be vigilance and the courage in the face of American rights and freedoms being trod upon by religious extremists and other parties who dump the Bible and the Constitution and who don't understand either one. Coincidentally, this also happens to be the year of the snake in the Chinese zodiac calendar, and how is that for incidental symbolism? Almost every other party I've yet discussed wants to go in another direction than I do. I want to go forward. The primary reason that we need a party that isn't just democratic and isn't just green, but which is also assuredly secular, is that religiously minded factions in this country are of the general impression that these are the last days. And that is their excuse for being economically and ecologically incompetent. They literally believe there's no tomorrow. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what kind of future will we leave our heirs if we continue to dominate and subdue the earth, while retarding our students' capacity to correct that course? I must accept that there will be a future, despite what the religious nuts want to believe. They've always been wrong about everything anyway. So I say we prepare for that future and do our best to make it futuristic, so that when the time comes and we hand it over to the next generation, we won't have to apologize for its condition.